question and answer or discussion. But the first group to go is going to be the measurement group, led by Alden Gross, David Ryan, and Benoit Jobin. However you guys want to do it, take it away.
Wow, had no idea we were going first, but we're going first because measurement is so fundamental to everything that we do. You know, I was just remarking earlier today that if you have bad measurements, if you had poor measurements, it's kind of like smearing Vaseline on your glasses and then going out to drive. Our local neighborhood ophthalmologists do not recommend that you do that because it's bad for the science. It's a waste of time for our participants and all sorts of things. So let's get into it. So measurement, one caveat up front, when we talk about measurement across contexts, there are measurement needs for clinical care when you see an individual patient. There are measurement needs for mechanistic research studies and in population-based research studies. And these levels of measurement are all different. For pragmatic reasons, in the 4 hours that we spent together and in the 10 minutes that I have to summarize our 4 hours of spirited discussion, we're only going to focus on measurement of sensory functions in population-based studies. So broadly speaking, taking a step back for a minute, what do we need for a good measurement? We need the measure to be reliable. We need it to be and to be precise. And in another slide, I'm going to talk about how we can use information about reliability to inform what we can use our measurement tool for. We need validity evidence. We need evidence, a measure needs to have face validity. It has to have construct validity, which implies that you have a well-defined construct. So when we talk about priority areas, one of our priority areas is it's really important to define and to understand your construct and to understand, for example, if you've got objective measures and self-report measures, those might be measuring distinct but overlapping constructs. We have criterion-related validity, which requires you to have a gold or a reference standard. And of course, equally important is content validity. We have to make sure the content of what we're assessing is measuring the content of the underlying attribute that we want to measure. Separate from validity is utility. So validity is asking the question, is my measure measuring the thing that I want to measure? Is my measure measuring contrast sensitivity? Utility is asking, let's assume that we have a measure that measures contrast sensitivity. Utility is asking, is that measure useful? Does it predict mortality? Does it predict dementia? What's its utility? What is the utility of the measurement in clinical and for public health purposes? So it's useful to keep separate in your mind validity work and utility work. So yeah, there's that. One of the things that we talked about today was different ways that we can use reliability to inform the use of our measurement instrument. And we talked about, in different for different research questions, we might need a screening test or we might need a measurement for longitudinal purposes. So I just wanted to give a brief primer on reliability. So as it turns out, measurement developers can use reliability concepts to clarify the purpose of their test. And I'm using a rubric from, I think, 1985, a taxonomy of uses for a test. You can have tests that are used for discriminative purposes, predictive, or evaluative purposes. A discriminative purpose means the measure provides information for differentiating people along some underlying trait. You drop in, you measure them once, and you want to have a really good idea of, are they a 0.5 or are they a -1? Whatever score they have along your underlying trait. Predictive means you want to classify people into groups. Think about a screening test. And evaluative, the measure is going to be used to quantify rates of change or progression over time. So you're going to be measuring repeatedly over time. So I have a cartoon here that maybe for the sake of time, we won't go into too much detail, but when I teach my measurement class, I go wild on this thing for like 30 minutes. It's so much fun. The y-axis is reliability. Higher reliability is good. And the x-axis is the level along your latent trait. You can have low vision, high vision, poor contrast sensitivity, really strong contrast sensitivity, whatever your construct of interest is. So we've got two tests. Test P is in please, and test D is in David. Test P has really high precision or reliability along a relatively narrow range of the latent trait at around positive 1.5 standard deviations. And regardless of how you got that reliability, maybe it's test retest, maybe it's internal consistency reliability, reliability can vary across the range of your underlying latent trait. Test P would make a really great predictive test as long as 1.5 standard deviations is relevant for distinguishing cases, okay? Test D would make a horrible predictive test, but test D would make a pretty nice discriminative test because reliability is in this range of it's above 0.8 across 4 standard deviations, which is like 97% of your sample. Test P would make a horrible discriminative test because it's really only precise in a narrow range of ability. So as we think about the measures that we develop, think about not just reliability as one number, but think about where you're providing measurement. Think about where you're providing precision of your measurement, and then think about how that reliability can be mapped onto what you can do with that measure. So with that wonderful primer, what do we know? Measurement is important. If we're not measuring, we're not managing it. Some of the things we know is that our measurements have variable quality across the senses. Dual impairment is really important, and that's something that's under-recognized for folks outside of this room, I think. Screeners and longitudinal measurement tools have different properties, as I talked about on the previous screen. There's a trade-off between reliability and scalability. Oftentimes, if we want reliabilities in the 0.95 range, you've got to spend a lot of time collecting really detailed measurement, which may not be scalable for our population-based studies. There's important differences between self-reported perceptions and objective measures that we have to pay attention to and that we have to tell other people to pay attention to. And many measures do not distinguish impairment due to peripheral organ versus central processing. So we can't always distinguish those things. We may be interested, but that's an open question. We have a whole lot of current gaps, and I'm probably about like 4 minutes into a 10-minute presentation. So I'm just gonna keep talking until they rake me off the podium, take me off the podium. What we need to know about a sensory phenotype for research is different from what a clinician needs to know. So our recommendation is to align your measurement tool to the scale of the study of the research question that you have, and whether you're doing a population-based or a mechanistic study. I think we need to think carefully about your construct or your target of measurement. You know, do we care about whether a construct affects a person's life and function, or do we care about biological mechanisms and physiology? Your measurement choice, particularly whether you choose a self-report versus an objective measure, and how much you spend collecting that measure, depends on your question that you're going to be asking. Longitudinal changes. One gap that we have across all the sensory abilities is what age does decline begin for a given sensory ability? How frequently, and this has implications for how frequently do we need to measure it in a study? Is hearing really hearing really changing every 2 years to a considerable degree, for example? What measures are sensitive in the age range in which a study is interested? One of the things we talked about in our group is, you know, in gerontology, we usually start most of our studies at age 65 plus. field of gerontology is getting younger. We're starting to look at ages 60 plus, 55 or 50 plus, especially when we move into other countries. So we need to be thinking about measures of sensory function in younger ages as well. And are there different measurement needs for different senses? So one interesting conversation that we had both yesterday and today is olfaction has really great screening tests, measures that you can just put in the mail to participants, but there's a lack of validated, clinically precise measures. The opposite is true for vision and hearing. There are validated measures, but we need more scalable screeners that can be implemented within the fields. That's another current gap. Sure. We have some, okay. We have some current gaps. Then we listed some priority areas. Several are common across the senses and others are sensory specific. You can read these later. These are common across the senses. We have priority areas, short-term and long-term for vision, hearing, olfaction, and taste. And these are our participants. Sorry. I misrepresented probably 3 hours out of the 4 hours that our work group had together. Does anybody else have anything that they wanted to highlight or showcase? Yeah. David, did you have anything you wanted to say? Because you're in my field of vision.
So I'll just speak for vision. Maybe someone can speak for olfactory. We spent a lot of time talking about those two. Also, taste. I think the issue for vision is we've looked great tools like in clinic to measure lots of different visual function. We struggle a little bit, especially with evaluated measures that can be used at scale to measure population differences. Another big gap, I know there's folks in Josh's group working with enhanced data, thinking about thresholds for clinically relevant thresholds for contrast sensitivity. There's needs to be more work in terms of it, like with the threshold for contrast sensitivity, establishing the utility of those thresholds in terms of predicting clinically important things about people's life. We think that for a short-term goal, there could be a working group to talk about presenting vision acuity versus best corrected vision, making those distinguishing those two in terms of disability and then also nomenclature that can be used commonly across studies to make the different issues clear. In longer term for vision, we want to establish self-administered technology-based screening tests that can allow us to get measures of evaluated vision remotely without a field administrator there in the room.
I was going to talk about olfaction and taste.
Yeah, but yeah, we included taste because it was forgotten in this conference a little bit. Yeah, I think also specifically for olfaction, we should measure more than odor identification. Most studies include odor identification. It's good, but it's not sufficient. So I think we will need to include, for example, olfactory detection threshold, discrimination of odors, odors memory that can be relevant for early markers for Alzheimer's disease, for example. So I think it will be super important, and also longitudinal follow-up and maybe, as we said, for all the senses, to start maybe younger in the 50s and to be able to measure not only the cross-sectional level, but the decline of the olfactory function. And I would say every senses. And for taste, yeah, just to include taste, to better understand what are the implications with aging. Is it can it be predictive for a cognitive decline? I think we don't know enough so far. Yeah.
The last thing was more question development, psychometric testing of self-reported measures across all senses, and then relating those self-reported measures to gold standards, which kind of goes to the goal of having scalable population-based measures. If we had great self-report questions, we could just field those. So.
One more comment? Okay.
Yeah, so just one question there. So, with self-report, they often are referring to basically people's actual perceptual experiences. And then the tests that you've listed so far are mostly a peripheral function. I'm just kind of curious whether you talked much about central visual processes or same thing with other senses in terms of, opportunities for measurement.
We did talk about that. We talked about how, the importance of, clarifying what your research question is. In terms of the measurement, there's the science of what you want to relate your measurement to. But in terms of your measurement, if you've got a measure of something, can it distinguish this peripheral versus central processes distinction? And if it can, what can it say about it? Thinking carefully about your measurement and about the questions that you're asking. One last question.
So this is along those lines. We're going to be representing the intervention group, and this came up in our conversation with using appropriate measures so that we can not only assess the efficacy of what we're implementing as an intervention at the endpoint, but also the assessments that occur for evaluating the senses and the senses as a whole. So kind of two things. With the perception, we realized that there probably is a component of the importance of self-perception. Somebody may view themselves as an individual that cannot hear appropriately and thus may act like an individual that has objective findings. So finding ways to be able to crosswalk that and to be able to square that into an overall metric so that that's accounted for, because that will change the intervention. If someone doesn't have hearing loss but feels they have hearing loss, our intervention will be different than someone who has objective hearing loss. So that was one component that we'll get into as like a little prelude, but if you guys talked about that at all as a way to kind of develop a metric, and then overall, like the impact of broad sensory deficits. Is there a measure that we could develop to assess an individual across all sensory domains that can be incorporated, not necessarily from an objective standpoint, but how, again, do they perceive themselves as having deficits across those domains?
We did talk about that very briefly near the end of our time, and I think there's something in here about the importance of multisensory measurement. But yeah, we completely acknowledge everything that you're saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Alden, and the this is measurement. This Justice Key. So you just did measure. Yes. So the next group will be the intervention group, led by Jonathan Overvest, Ali Abraham, and Allison Wong. We do. We're working on pulling them up right now. No, you just have to wing it. No slides. Great.
Hi, everyone. Allison Abraham. Okay, so I'm going to try to speak for the intervention group. I feel like we're both less organized than Alden, and at points maybe more organized than Alden. So we'll see how this goes. Okay, so we sort of talked about what we knew in terms of each sense, because it's hard to sort of come up with a general gestalt across senses of what we know. So for hearing, we have the ACHIEVE trial. So we actually have some information on intervention that tends to hint that there may be some subgroup effects that are important. I think that there hasn't been enough work really to understand the pathways, and that could be important in terms of intervention. And of course, it was pointed out repeatedly, we really have very little information around cost effectiveness. Vision's a little bit behind hearing in terms of interventional studies. There's, I think, one ongoing in India right now. And of course, when I say interventional studies, what do you mean by the intervention? This one's looking at giving glasses. There's tons of data just cross-sectionally. There's also longitudinal study data that's been put through a meta-analysis that shows strong impacts of vision loss, vision impairment, usually defined by distance visual acuity. So I think that's another aspect that's important for intervention, is sort of what's been measured in terms of vision. Vision is complex. There's lots of axes of vision. So what are we really talking about with intervention? And then, same problem with sort of pathways. There's lots of studies linking vision loss to mediators of cognitive decline, such as depression. Oops, sorry. So, I think that sort of has implications for what is your goal? Is it just around cognition, or is it really around sort of more of a whole person health perspective, where you're trying to just improve healthy aging, not just, brain function? And then there's, lots of information around cataract. So cataract interventions and their cost effectiveness and effectiveness on cognition. Finally, olfaction. So olfaction probably is even a little bit farther down the scale of information that we have from the literature. So there's not great information on dose response. There's certainly epi studies that link impairment to olfaction. And they're sort of limited in terms of the domains. Against, senses are complex, and so we're sort of studying a uni-domain format for a lot of these senses. Olfaction training does seem to have some benefits, so that's interesting to know. There's also some studies in vision training, so some of the training modalities may be important to understand for interventions. And again, there's just complexities that really haven't been teased out in the literature. So this just proves that we actually did work. I know you thought we were just dancing on the table the whole time, and we did a little of that, but we did try to do some concept mapping. It wasn't easy, and you're going to see exactly the clarity of mind that we brought to the process. Okay, so we changed the slide here because we had trouble sort of focusing on the slides that were given to us. So we have themes of discussion. So just so you can sort of get a sense of all the topics that we covered in our 3 hours. So a lot of it really did talk about sort of centering on the patient, user-centered design. This is sort of what John brought up, that, it really depends on sort of the end goal. So, for somebody who has objective vision loss, maybe that end goal is to bring that loss up to something that, that looks like normal vision. But what if you have somebody who doesn't have loss objectively, but they perceive that they're struggling with their vision? And that may be because they started at a really great level of vision and they're slightly declined from that, or it may be contextual, things in their environment that make them feel like they're less secure with their vision. It could be something we're not measuring. So we often measure, again, distance acuity, but what if it's actually a visual processing issue? So we're just not measuring the actual problem. So, bringing the user into this is going to be incredibly important for any intervention that we talk about. And those interventions are going to look really different, sort of depending upon what we get to as the underlying problem. Accounting for the patient experience, so that's sort of the same thing. We had lots of discussions around communication and dissemination. So I think this is sort of low-hanging fruit in the sense that, we can start now thinking about how we do better education in the community. I often go talk to older adults and, you'd be surprised sort of at the lack of understanding of some of the connections around sensory loss and aging outcomes. So just getting into the community to do a little work with education, I think could be hugely beneficial. And then we heard this morning about the importance of really connecting with policymakers. So some of the communication and dissemination aspects were discussed a lot. Marketing. So how do we make hearing aids sexy, for example? Turns out you can probably do it, right? Apple's done a great job with design, but we really haven't thought a lot about this. So sort of getting the acceptability of some interventions or sensory devices into the culture, to make them more appealing is something that we could all work on. What do those marketing strategies look like? Again, how do you make hearing aids sexy? We talked a lot about cost effectiveness, and then sort of some of the common themes, multisensory loss and subgroup effects. Okay. So we tried very hard to put this on sort of a time scale. Really, I think this was like paint splatters, a shotgun approach. We just threw them all up here. So I'm not sure the time scale is really important or applicable for some of these. So again, sort of the short-term things would be some of the communication and partnerships with communities. And, we talked a lot about measurement, but that has been well covered. We talked about some of the design aspects that are going to be important, including sort of addressing the stigma piece. And then, I think, again, back to the communication message, how do you sort of market things more broadly to change the culture around sensory aids? Okay, so priority areas, short term, well, we sort of didn't put the terms on this because we couldn't figure it out, but we just took all the long-term, short-term goals off of it. The communication and education, so policy papers, marketing and framing for adoption and integration, and community engagement were sort of things that we thought we could start intervening sooner rather than later. Again, anything that you're thinking about for interventions really has to have a user-centered design approach. So starting to strategize around how we're bringing users and community members into a process for developing interventions. That's also, a piece that Bonnie talked about, really making sure that everything is an inclusive process. And, understanding sort of the patient experience and what is the core problem that we're dealing with. Is it really a perception thing or is it an objective thing? So, and then finally closing the gap between efficacy, effectiveness, and implementation. I think a lot of work will have to be done on the implementation side. We know that glasses work, we know hearing aids work, but you can't get people to wear their hearing aids. You can't get people necessarily to wear their readers. So, trying to figure out how we make these things, how we overcome the barriers that are keeping people from using sensory aids is going to be really important. I think that's it. Now I'm going to throw it out to the group. Any things that I missed people want to comment on? Where's my group members? All right.
Is this on? Yeah. Overall, I think our conversation spread across multiple domains and we found ourselves edging into some of the other areas. So I think it was for interventions. I think it really kind of covers a lot of different areas where the priorities lie.
Yeah, I think at this stage, just because of everything still developing, where if you look at the field of olfaction, there really are minimal or limited interventions. Gustatory is even less, and then proprioception, gosh, that didn't even really get much airspace. So those areas, we don't have specific devices or therapeutics, but as they come available with the basic research, we were trying to provide some framework of how to fit that in, to make sure that we had the end users in mind and understand that even if we came up with a great product that we feel like would be a solution, how do we implement that at a scale that's reasonable from a financial standpoint? So understanding budgetary constraints, and then also understanding kind of what they would want and how do we convey that. And in medicine, it can be challenging, as we all know. It's not always what people need, and that's how we approach things. If we say, hey, this is going to be necessary for you to live a fulfilling life, but it's you want to lead a fulfilling elder life. And how do we communicate that message without falling into a little bit more of a gray zone of non-data supported medical endeavors?
Kathy online has a comment or question. Kathy, you can go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I saw on one of your slides the word stigma. So the adoption of technology, stigma, I saw it on your slide, so I assume that's going to be in your report. The other thing that we found in a cross-nation study, the US is a little different in terms of the kind of sales mentality, shall I say. And Nick, in his presentation, mentioned the importance of service versus just selling technology. So the perception of the public that you're a salesperson is different than what actually the public wants, which is a trusted health professional. So I think trust, if you could just add the word trust along with the word stigma, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. Anything else? Okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Ally and the intervention group. We're going to move on to the mechanism group next. And for mechanisms, I see Natalie heading down right now, and she was co-hosted the group, co-led the group with Jenny and Moon, and hearing what you guys had to say.
You could refresh the slides because the beauty of going, you can update the couple slides. Or it won't be the worst thing. If Thank you. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So, I need to orient myself. Is it just like this? Yep. Okay, great. I'm representing our awesome mechanisms group, and we weren't as thoughtful as Alden to put all the group members on the first slide, but they're all on the last slide, and we'll have a look at them. So, okay. There we go. Okay, so we started with this, I cannot say the word strongly enough, conceptual framework, where we thought, let's just try to get some cards on the table about potential mechanisms. And so we sketched out the possibilities of common, third variable, shared, age-related biological processes that could affect sensory function and cognitive and brain health, but are not causally related to each other. Then we talked about the potential for direct causes between sensory loss and cognitive decline and brain health and cognitive outcomes, with a bit of a feedback loop illustrated with the yellow arrows, and then the potential pathway for socially mediated outcomes, knowing the relationship between sensory impairment, engagement in everyday activities, and psychosocial well-being and cognitive outcomes. So we just used this as our broad starting point. And what we all agreed on is that there's the likelihood of shared, at least conceptual mechanisms across the senses in their relationship to cognitive outcomes. But of course, at a granular level, the mechanisms are going to be likely quite different. So we were certainly agreed on that. We said, what do we know? What do we agree on what we know? We know there's strong okay, so this, there we are, it's over there. We know there's strong associations between sensory loss, especially good evidence for hearing, vision, olfaction, and dementia risk and cognitive outcomes. We know about the associations. We know that the mechanisms are likely to be multi-level, including biological, behavioral, and social factors. We are pretty confident that these are going to be, for some instances, bidirectional pathways. We know that social determinants of health are going to be important. And we know that for some senses, neuroimaging evidence supports the idea of cortical reorganization and compensatory mechanisms for some senses. And we know very little about other senses. So the evidence is a little better for hearing. And, you know, we don't know much about things like taste and proprioception. I'm Canadian, so I like to always say, like, why do we matter? Why do the mechanisms matter? It's because, of course, we rely on good measurement. So that's our call out to the measurement group. And you need to understand mechanisms for evidence-based intervention and policy. So that's our call out to the other working groups. Okay, so current gaps. We really don't understand causality, so at all. So we know about associations, but we don't understand causality, and we don't understand the temporality. And I think this came up in some of the earlier talks. When does sensory loss begin? When does that matter in terms of influencing cognition? There are understudied senses, the vestibular system, olfaction, taste, somatosensory systems, completely understudied. There's an inconsistent use of appropriate and validated measurement tools. There's limited integration across those levels of analyses. In a lot of cases, we assume there's linear trajectories, but this is an assumption, and it's quite likely there are nonlinear relationships depending on degree of sensory loss. And these are likely to be dynamically shaped and adaptive over the lifespan. There's very sparse early life data. Most cohorts begin in midlife. If we're lucky, we really need to go earlier in the time scale than that, because if you think about a relationship with Alzheimer's disease, for example, we know that Alzheimer's disease biomarkers themselves start to change decades before somebody presents for diagnosis. So we need to go much earlier in the lifespan. There are gaps in mechanistic bridges between cellular, animal, human, and lab-based and population research that we still need to address these. We know that there's not a lot of incorporation of concepts of brain resilience, brain reserve, cognitive reserve, and maintenance could certainly influence the mechanistic outcomes. And there's limited information about polygenic and exposome data. So, okay. What are our priorities for research in the short term? This is like an exercise in visual acuity. Okay. So enhance existing longitudinal studies. We really want to do a call out for having multiple senses represented in current studies. You can see the senses listed here. Develop guidelines for sensory adapted testing in cognitive and functional assessment. So we liked, Jennifer, your comments earlier about having cognitive measures that respect the fact that older adults present with multiple sensory deficits. How do we integrate biomarkers, imaging, neuroplasticity, combining both objective and subjective sensory data? So we think the interface between what we measure as performance and what a person perceives and experiences in their everyday life due to their sensory function, those separately provide important information. Okay, we still need to bridge communities between cellular, animal, human, lab-based, and population researchers. We need to improve how we handle confounders, and we need to disaggregate data. As a minimum, we need to disaggregate data by sex and gender. And ideally, we disaggregate it for other important socioeconomic variables as well. We need to leverage the exposome data that's now becoming available. We need to think about how we harness ethical AI models for when we tap into high quality data sets. And what does that say? there's still foundational conceptual work to be done in terms of identifying those common pathways and the sensory specific mechanisms. Long-term research, we are putting the call out for lifespan longitudinal cohorts starting early in life to map temporality and causal directions. As I said, AD neuropathology starts decades earlier before people present. And so we need, if we think sensory health relates to dementia risk, then we need to start our measures earlier as well. We need RCTs and mechanistic trials to test sensory interventions with cognitive outcomes, so that can then inform our mechanistic models. We need mechanism-informed interventions, looking at sensory stimulation, environmental enrichment, and social engagement. We need to integrate polygenic risk and molecular data to identify susceptible subgroups and biological pathways. We really need to scale levels of evidence. This is a tall order in terms of linking cellular and molecular mechanisms to human behavioral cognitive findings, and then embedded in people's preferences. We need more cross-country and equity-focused studies. And I think this is our slide of acknowledgements. We had an awesome group. People were really contributory. We had diverse expertise. And we'd like to thank our little friend ChatGPT, which was, I'm just going to say, did not give us any of the content. All of the content was contributed by the humans in the room, but we used ChatGPT to summarize the slides into conceptual groupings. There we go. Way over time, probably. Okay. Natasha.
Natalie. Thank you. I was debating if I should do measurement or if I should do mechanisms, but I think, yeah, I appreciate what you've come up with. So kind of reflecting a little bit on the work that we were doing, and I heard from internal feedback from your group that there was a lot of discussion about measurement in the mechanism group, and talking from our group, we were reminding each other not to talk about mechanisms because we were going to talk about measurements. But I think one of the points that I was raising when we were thinking about what measures should we be using for the sensory assessments, I was bringing up a point, and that's in like one of the common priorities, that we have to think about the overlap of our sensory measures and our cognitive measures. While we were not intending on talking about what are the best cognitive measures to study all of this, you've tapped a little bit into blood-based biomarkers and other objective assessments of neurodegeneration to get potentially at this common cause that might be underlying behind it. It might be shared across different senses. But I think when we are writing this, what will be interesting is to kind of re-merge these points from these different groups, where clearly there is overlap, and see how we can kind of come back and bring this all together to a common theme. So it was very reassuring to see that you had overlapping ideas clearly to us. So I just kind of want to compliment the room, I guess, on sharing the same ideas and like coming up with these important points.
Yeah, absolutely. We had to do the same thing in our group, which is, we would slide into measurement or slide into intervention. They were like, no, mechanism, we got to stop there, knowing that this synergy would start to happen. I would just say, like, I did really resonate with Jennifer's comments earlier today about, at least for cognitive assessment, present cognitive stimuli in both a visual and an auditory modality, and don't worry about whether you've got a hearing adapted version or a vision adapted version. Just make it accessible to people. And I think also we need to think about, we think maybe we all already understand everything we need to know about the relationship between hearing loss or vision loss and depression or social networks, but even those measures are not very well adapted to older adults with sensory loss. And it could be the things that we're perceiving as losses or changes in the social networks of those individuals we're just not asking the question the right way. Because if somebody, has, maybe they have given up on a particular activity, but have incorporated or adapted to other activities that continue to bring them enrichment and cognitive stimulation, recognizing their sensory limitations. So I'm not even sure that we've done a great job in adapting our psychosocial participatory measures all that well. So maybe that's another measurement thing for us to think about. The other thing we did say, and then I'll get off what we realize is that physicians don't like to screen for anything if they don't have a treatment or referral pathway. And so if we really want people to get on board with sensory screening, I think to the extent that we can offer plausible mechanisms and potential evidence-based interventions, then we will start to get more people on board in terms of incorporating sensory health into routine care, because nobody's going to screen for something if they don't have a pathway for dealing with it.
All right, you guys are already up here. Technology group, led by Mark Albers and Tristan Best.
Terrific. Well, first, I just want to thank Jennifer, Josh, Jay, and Varshney for organizing this 2 days, and all the great so far content, everything I've learned a ton so far. I'm here representing the technology group, and we went with a picture here, and his names are on the second slide, and we had great discussions. These are our 3 bullet points that will be reflected through our 10-minute presentation. One is that we want to use technology to develop multimodal sensory phenotyping for aging, and then ultimately preclinical and symptomatic neurodegenerative diseases. We want to use technology to make these tests accessible and amenable to longitudinal testing. We heard that from some of the other groups. And then with a focus on precision. And that way it's easier to measure differences. And so with the idea that we focus on multidimensional adaptable testing, data science, and then using some of the newer technologies. Again, these are the excellent work groups. It was a pleasure and an honor to work with them. We, from the very beginning, in the first 10 minutes, we split sensory changes from peripheral, we thought about peripheral as well as central. So peripheral end organ versus central processing. And we use that through our discussion, this theme. So we've heard already that there's an augmentation of end organ function helps in terms of reducing the risk of dementia. And central auditory processing has also been shown to be a risk factor for development of dementia. We've heard about the visual variant of Alzheimer's disease, or posterior cortical atrophy, where you have changes in visual processing areas that lead to visual problems. And then typically in the patients that I see, 2-3 years later, they get memory problems, et cetera. 50% of those patients have Alzheimer's disease, but it presents in the visual cortex. And we see that with olfaction, as we've heard about, that there's early changes in olfactory function preceding the development of symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, and Parkinson's disease. Now I'll turn it over to Tristan. He's going to take us through this part of the gaps.
So first I want to talk about just some common, tests that we're using, thinking about it from this kind of central versus peripheral lens that we've been talking about. So starting with vision and kind of the low level or peripheral-ish, it measures like acuity, contrast sensitivity, and then kind of moving up to more central processing, things like visual search and training, which I do have existing visual components. We also thought about moving from, a lot of paper tasks we use, looking at things to more digital tasks as well. Kind of as that. So thinking things like retinal imaging, eye tracking, imaging, and visual potentials. With regard to hearing, we have the same kind of dichotomy, which is things like keratoconal audiometry, looking at peripheral hearing, and then going to speech audiometry, things like speech and noise, dichronic identification tests, which are more central auditory processing skills, as well as looking at kind of things like self-reported function survey. So seeing how people perceive their hearing tests, and then looking at listening activities. And then with regard to olfaction, which is a bit of a mixed bag, you have things looking at peripheral causes, such as like an ENT endoscopic exam, and then looking at kind of more central, mixed peripheral, looking at things such as odor identification or discrimination and thresholds. And that brought us to kind of where our gaps are. And we thought about our gaps in two different ways. So what are the data gaps that we have? And then what are the technology gaps that we have? So the first kind of data gap that we thought of that really, well, maybe not the first we thought of, but one of the things that we're first is that there's really, we're testing a lot in these controlled environments and not really meeting people where they are in these kind of real world that might be having more difficulty in a clinic. There's also a number of data gaps that we have. So these are things like addressing the multiple stages of sensory and cognitive processing, things like interventions, like CRTs to test causal relationships, but as well as looking at pragmatic trials using multi-domain interventions, and then data that addresses population heterogeneity, particularly in regard to sensory cognitive trajectories, and then the interventions that those individuals might need. And then data, importantly, from underserved or underrepresented populations to address some problematic health disparities. It's also important to look at the relative contributions of co-pathologies in neurodegenerative disorders. So think about amyloid tau, TDP-43, and how these might impact sensory cognitive functioning in both preclinical and then clinical stages of the disease. With regard to technology gaps, I think the first thing we really need to think about is when we're designing new technologies and new measurements is integrating leadership roles on design teams for people with lived experiences with sensory loss. We also need validated, accessible, multisensory assessments, particularly using at-home devices if possible, things like phones, much imagination run wild on that one. Also accessible technologies for augmenting sensory function at the intervention level. And then scaling these technologies through these interventions or assessments through technology to enhance inclusion of populations that really tend to participate less in studies. And having assessments or interventions adapted for people with uni and multisensory needs, and having adaptive assessments with emerging technologies. You can think VR, augmented reality, AI, etc. And then really leveraging modern data science with the goal of creating these foundational models that incorporate sensory changes into kind of our aging. And with that, we'll hear Albert to discuss the priority.
Yeah, thanks. So again, we tried to distill it down into these priority recommendation or areas and recommendations. And so one is to develop and validate accessible tests that include or embed AI for multisensory testing. So we think of these as one test, but maybe there's ways that we can incorporate them across different modalities, and then deconvolute later using data science. And then these could be screens at home or assessments at home, and then people who screen fail or have a signal, then they come in for more in-depth training, or it's adaptive and there's more in-depth training. So secondly is adapting current validated tests, again, what we heard this morning, and creating new tests for people with peripheral sensory loss and leveraging other senses. And the last thing is to really facilitate longitudinal testing, because then each person can serve as their own control. And also some of these tests that are less validated, such as changed a little bit for hearing loss or something, where we don't have all the norms, if the person is is tested longitudinally, then changes that they have can be significant as an outcome. And so we want to develop accessible tools that integrate multiple dimensions of sensory signal and addressing, again, peripheral and central causes, and then being able to deconvolute that. Being able to then use implementation science to be able to envision how these technologies are used and how do they get used in greater detail. And then finally engage with the AD Knowledge Portal and other open science platforms so we can collect all this data that we all generate and harmonize it in order to feed it into foundational models so that we can then incorporate sensory changes into these broader foundational models that are being built now in these different neurodegenerative diseases. That's what we thought of in the first 3 years. Longer term, we really think that these longitudinal studies to develop the trajectories are needed so that we can move beyond single measure risk thresholds into trajectories and changes that yourself personally, and that can be related to self-report as well as objective measures. Then to be able to use these technologies to convince pharmaceutical companies to use these tools to screen participants for inclusion into clinical trials. It's much cheaper to screen at home than bring the person in that screens positive for a tau PET scan or something like that. So I think that will then lead to further implementation and further funding, and then ultimately get them into outcomes in clinical trials. Does changing tau, does changing amyloid improve or stabilize sensory functioning? We can use these sensory tests to probe these circuits that are vulnerable in these neurodegenerative diseases. And finally, can we then take these together and form one tool, games, that would incorporate vision, sensory, olfaction, balance, etc., and be ready to embrace the new generation that's coming into the risk profile, as we heard earlier, where we're looking at people in their 50s who are comfortable with games and being able to do that. Embedding at-home sensory testing in primary care workflows. Do your test at home, the algorithm and the result is in the electronic health record before the PCP sees the patient at the annual wellness visit. And then finally, using data science for predictive and foundational models so that we can leverage what we learn about sensory testing in terms of relating it to molecular biomarkers and imaging. So finally, thanks to the whole working team, and we hope this is the future.
Thank you. Lovely presentation. So you did such a nice job of talking about how we can use technology for measurement and screening. I was a little surprised you didn't have more discussion about how to use technology as the intervention. So how aging adults can use technology in order to accommodate their sensory loss or improve their experience with sensory loss. Was there discussion around that?
No, it's a great point. We did not spend much time on the intervention side of things in ways that we could use technology therapeutically. There certainly is lots of ways that it can be augmentation devices, but it wasn't something that we focused on. You saw what we focused on, but we didn't. But it's a great point. It's something that if we had more time, we should have spent more time on.
Clearly the intervention group and technology group should get together.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you, Technology Group. And last but certainly not least, the Policy Implementation Science Group led by Nick Reed, Pamela Dalton, and Patrice Hicks. Just your slides up now. And then we should have time at the end for any more discussion or summative comments that anybody has. And then we'll go into our last coffee break.
Dalton. I'm on the cusp of being an elderly white woman with red hair that was natural, but is somewhat artificially enhanced. Sorry? Oh, okay. It's somewhat artificially maintained at this point. Okay, so I was really excited to hear all of the themes that emerged from the other presentations because we went sort of a walk through the forest yesterday, throwing a lot of these ideas around, not really knowing the path that we would take. And at some point today, all of these themes became relevant, but we took sort of a very macro view of things. So, and how do I? Okay. So what we ended up thinking about was the process for policy, as well as what is lacking in our ability to promote policies right now. And one of the overarching things we talked about is that sensory health is typically framed as being important for a lot of non-sensory outcomes, rather than just the intrinsic importance of maintaining sensory health throughout the lifespan itself. And we wanted to keep that front and center in some of our discussions. Now, the strategies for things like intervention often cover cognitive health, and we talked about olfaction and some of the strategies, but there are very few programs and services on broad multisensory health. And we talked about how healthy aging really needed to position itself within sensory and cognitive aging into a much more integrated care context. From a policy perspective, how do we achieve this? And so some of the gaps that we identified that we think policy changes can actually address are that there's a lot of data, but it's fragmented on the burdens, the barriers, and the healthcare economics around sensory health, which leads us to have little in the way of implementation science that we can draw on to make these compelling policy recommendations. In some of the sensory areas, we completely lacked CPT or ICD-10 codes for insurance. And in others, there is a lack of specificity in terms of, an all or nothing as opposed to degrees of severity. And we think that siloing, we did not really talk specifically about individual sensory systems, but that siloing of sensory areas in patient care, research, education, and advocacy actually limits what we can do in bringing the importance of sensory health forward. And so by doing that, we identified there really is a lack of infrastructure for including a singular forum for ecosystem mapping of sensory health more broadly. And so what we identified as priority areas was really an infrastructure for policy. And this includes things like planning, establishing, and building an infrastructure around cross-collaboration across people doing work in all different sensory areas, as well as the diseases that sensory dysfunction can lead to. Ensuring that there are patient partners in research and patient advocacy at every step of the way, and understanding and establishing a process for funding for feasibility and implementation trials, because these are often not things that federal funding agencies are willing to support in that level. Long-term, we wanted to, at a policy level, provide a sustainable ecosystem that would allow the establishment of a professional organization. Now, this was modeled really on Nick's experience with the American Dental Association and their auxiliary group, which is really just a professional think tank that is out there to push ideas and push positions toward understanding education, advocacy for different kinds of policies. And this could be done with sort of the help of the Sense Network, but it would be independent. And so one of the goals would be to educate the next generation of clinicians and scientists, as well as to obtain some sustainable support. And so Nick put this together, and I don't know whether he wants to chime in, but we see this as being independent of the Sense network, but in a bidirectional relationship, so that the Sense network is made up of research, academics, and clinicians, but what we call Sense is the policy think tank that would actually push some of these things forward, where there would be a permanent staff and fundraising, recommendations that would encounter things like education of clinicians, funding agencies, et cetera. But most important, a policy agenda and messaging. People that would write op-eds that would appear in the popular press more regularly, things that could go out to specific agencies to make them understand the importance of this, and would ultimately be a forum for all the stakeholders, clinicians, academicians, patient advocates, people with lived experience, but that are all stakeholders related to policy, much the same way that the ADA has that secondary group. And we see this as following and sort of funding back to the Sense network, if you continue, which we certainly hope you do, that this policy arm could actually be where we take ideas and we take themes and the innovations and the recommendations that you're all making, and we put them into accessible policies, making sense kinds of messaging to the greater community. And so I will stop there and see if anyone has any questions, or anyone from this wonderful group that we all managed to come together and really coalesce on a central theme of doing this, has anything else to add. Thanks.
We're going to pass around a hat for donations to get this started. You'll be seeing it, don't be stingy.
Pam, you did a great job, I think, of representing what we talked about today. The one small thing I just want to mention, in case people that are on that, all the stakeholders, also we talked about industry playing a part in that as well, whether it's startups to big pharma or device manufacturers or whatnot. So that would also be a key stakeholder.
One of the targets and one of the stakeholders in this effort as well, and possibly also a funding source, as we well know. Other comments or questions? I think we have some time left for general discussion. Thank you.
So we have a bit of time now. If anybody has questions or comments that they'd like to make about any of the presentations or the totality of the presentations, having now heard them all, I think there's some really great take homes that we can as a group put together in drafting these recommendations and thinking about how to best articulate them and make them feel cohesive, make them feel like a common set of recommendations that kind of fit together well. And some of those comments, I think, reflect on that about, for example, Ali's comment about the technology, the intervention group coming together so we can try to make these things seem sort of seamless. One of the, I'll just make the comment that one of the things that I thought was great, I think it was the mechanism group, but I may be misremembering, had a timeline laying out sort of these are the kind of first priorities we'd want to look at, and then these are sort of the medium term and the longer term. And I think that may be a nice way, possibly across all of the work group areas, of thinking about how we want to attack things, how we want to recommend the scientific community move forward, just providing a little sort of temporality and prioritization. But that was one thought that I had that Jennifer and I were just talking about, but I'll stop there. Yeah, please.
So one question that I had kind of throughout this whole meeting is that it seems there's kind of more and more of these networks that are coming together that are trying to tackle different aspects of, how to achieve better healthy aging. And the one thing which wasn't clear to me is kind of, I think this is kind of a Sense network question, is kind of how does the Sense network see its intersection with other groups? Like, for instance, I'm part of another group that's trying to come up with assessments for primary prevention trials. And so they want to know, like, what are the perceptual or sensory measures that they would include? And, so this issue of like interactions across networks trying to solve the same problems. Yeah. how are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I'll provide my thoughts. Jennifer, feel free to chime in. So I think there's a couple of things there. One is, you mentioned sort of other networks, other groups asking about, well, how do we measure sensory health, or how do we integrate thinking about sensory health into what we're doing? And that's actually one of our charges as a network, is to provide those kinds of, I'm going to use the word services. Maybe it's not services maybe not the right term, but to provide that kind of interaction and to provide that know-how for implementation or thinking about sensory health in the larger sort of geriatric or gerontological context. We also have built out links very intentionally with other networks, with other centers, like Pepper centers on aging, like some of the centers on minority health. And so there have been some very intentional kind of interfaces and outreaches to try to integrate what we're doing with larger thinking in geriatrics and gerontology. Part of that also comes to play in things like GSA, putting together symposia to try to introduce sensory health to people who are not necessarily familiar with it or working in the sensory health space, to foment those conversations and make what we're doing sort of more widely accessible and better integrated. Is that? Yes. And Nini, sitting in the front row here, has put together a poster that'll be viewable in just an hour or so when we start the poster session, where the purpose really is to talk about how we've put together this data bank, the idea behind which is to make data on sensory aging and health more readily accessible. There's a lot of data out there. People just don't know it's there, or if it's there, if they know it's there, they don't know how to access it. And so this data bank is it live as of today? Yes, okay, that it's live as of today on the Sense Network website. Really tries to bring together publicly available cohort data with sensory aging measures and delineate which of those measures are in which studies, and also provide a guide as to how to get access to those data. So that hopefully will be a usable resource for the community.
Samit and I, thank you.
Yes.
There's one question online. Curious if any clinicians or researchers have thoughts about how we can get clinicians to screen for smell issues when there are not really effective treatment options for most causes.
That sounds like a Jay question.
I'm looking at Jay.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that one thing we need is sort of awareness of where people can go to get smell tests. So that's not everywhere, and there are places to get it. And the second thing I think is we need more education about there are some treatable causes of smell loss. So if you don't test and you don't have an evaluation, you can't know whether it's treatable or non-treatable. So I think we have a lot of work to do to make testing available, and then education to know, what the causes are and which ones are treatable, and there are some.
Other thoughts or questions? Or is everybody just wanting to get to the coffee? It's okay too. Gotcha.
Just one really brief comment, and that is that, watching all the different presentations, it's so obvious that it is hard to talk about any one of these elements in isolation. Every single group struggled with going beyond their bounds to the other groups, purview. So I was just wondering about, as we move forward into what hopefully will be a white paper, how should we sort of logistically get together with all the other groups to really try to integrate some of those thoughts so that they're, more complete and less compartmentalized, which I think is a little bit artificial. And you have to answer this whole question right now.
Okay. Truthfully, of course, I don't necessarily have the answer. I mean, I think we're all open to suggestions as far as that, but I think there can be and should be sidebar conversations, right? Between, various groups where there's intersections to say, how does your thinking on mechanisms, how does that play into what we need to be thinking about with measurement, for example? Obvious intersections there. You know, these are artificial boundaries to some degree. And, you know, to some extent, those boundaries just help us make sense of what we're writing and make help the reader make sense of what they're reading, hopefully. But I think we do need to be careful that we're not letting those boundaries sort of constrain us.
Yeah, and if I can add just one quick thing onto that. I'm sorry if you thought you were off the hook, Allie, but you're not. So no, in all of our work group leads, we appreciate so much what you've done, but I think our task right now is to go back and start to put this together. And then you can better believe we're going to come back and ask for your help to make sure that the paper is representative. And if there's other ways that we can think about it. And so I'm kind of kidding, but yet I'm not. Like, we really would appreciate your help, and we'll definitely be in touch before the paper goes to press. And so I do appreciate that thought a lot. So thank you.
Kathy online has a comment. Kathy, you can go ahead.
This is just a relatively small thought, but as I was listening to the technology report, one thing I have noticed in my research where I've used, say, during COVID where I couldn't do a lab-based test, and I used Shoebox, and I allowed Shoebox to be available to the research participants so they could, go back and redo it. They had unlimited access to test their hearing. And I never expected that people would go back so many times. So I think the era of wearables, like Fitbits, people are, on a daily basis monitoring their steps. They're monitoring their sleep. They're monitoring all kinds of things about their health, which I think is probably really important for them coming around to realizing when they have a problem and what their problem is. So I think the self-testing, apart from the testing by primary care, self-testing is probably going to be a really important piece of the puzzle at some point. I don't know if the group thought about that or how they think about it.
Kathy? Okay. Hi, Kathy. Thanks so much for your comment. We definitely talked about it. And we talked about the idea both of real world data that's being collected passively by individuals, as well as stealth testing, where people are doing things and we're evaluating them without them even being consciously aware that they're being evaluated. And with the goal of really getting into real world experiences so that way, this was what affects everyday life and to help people have a better quality of life. And so it was definitely something that was discussed. We think that in terms of partnering with the industries so that with data use agreements, et cetera, as you know, are challenging. And so, we decided not to focus on it as much in terms of the wearables that people are passively collecting, as opposed to putting wearables into cognitive studies or longitudinal studies so that we can do that. So that's how we dealt with it, but it didn't really come out in the presentation. So thanks for bringing up that point.
Hey, is this working?
Yes.
Okay. We talked about real world evidence or real world measures from wearables, devices that people use like for their iPhones to see if they sound correct, like the way that they want them to sound, and talked about the need to encourage the collectors of those secondary data to include metadata that would allow us to characterize the sample, and that there needs to be more work, and this could be short-term work, in working with industry to think about questions that they don't mind fielding or that they can collect anyway that would help us characterize the samples when those data come in. Yeah, that's it.
Well, if I just another thought about this is I think, a lot of the policy is got to be driven by the public. So what I hear from our policymakers is we like your science, but it's never going to become a policy unless the public wants it. And I think a lot of this self-testing and awareness on the part of older people about, yes, I have a problem. Many of them don't actually know. They are uncertain if they have a problem. And can I do something about it? And for them to show up at their family practice doc, at their, whatever healthcare they're receiving and say, and for them to be assertive and say, look, this device says I'm not sleeping right, so I think there's something wrong with my sleep. Let's do something about it. It's the patient advocating for themselves, which will drive change in practice. And it's the public, older adults in this case, having raised awareness of the things they are missing out on because the policies aren't there, that will actually drive this way more than some study that we do. So I think engaging the public, like what does that look like? And actually giving them ownership of their own health, that is a fantastically interesting change in the way we do things. Kind of letting go of the professional scientific control and giving the control to the public.
Those are great comments. Thank you.
Oh, I really value the fact that, Kathy, you bring everything back to the individual and the experience. The one thing I would say about the self-testing that I think we need to be a little careful about is making sure individuals know how to use those data, because people interpret it based on issues that they read about, and sometimes it increases anxiety rather than lowering it. So I think the awareness is really important, but we need to make sure that people kind of know what to do with the data. And also, I guess, getting back at the equity issue, what I so often see is that people who are able to monitor their health, able to do that, are those individuals who have the resources to access the data, to access the insurance, to access other things. So we need to make sure that if we have people self-identifying and doing some of these assessments of their health, it is equitably distributed across the population and across people with resources and those who are resource challenged.
Those are great points.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's also, how to level the playing field. What I see now that I'm kind of immersed in, how 80-year-olds interact with each other, is they are peers. There's a lot of peer learning. So the advantaged peers are really being reached out to by ones who are less advantaged, and that's a whole other ethos. But that's a really important point: is how does it generalize across the population?
Great. I think unless there are any additional burning comments, anybody, will go ahead and end on that note. And we have coffee and tea out in the lobby, and we'll reconvene here in 15 minutes. Is that right? 3:15? 30 minutes, 3:30. Yeah. Great. Thank you all.
Computer, I unmute. I just unmuted, if that's okay.
Welcome everyone to our final hour of this conference before we get to the really fun part, which is the reception with the posters. We were so fortunate that we had several program officers across several different institutes who were planning to join us and give some reflections today. And of course, unfortunately, they were unable to join us. So I'm very sorry you get us instead. But we just kind of put together some broad reflections, and then I think we will have the opportunity for a little more discussion, and then again, the fun part to follow. I just wanted to start by reflecting over the past couple days and thinking about what a challenging assignment that we gave you all and how amazingly you rose to the challenge. So just so grateful that you came here today, that all of you are as interested in as you are in this really important work. And we're just really grateful to be part of this network with you. So thank you everyone for all of your efforts over the past couple of days. As I was sitting and kind of reflecting and hearing across the different groups during the plenary, there were some kind of cross-cutting themes that I heard. And so I think that's what I'm going to reflect on now. But I think there are challenges that go along with that. And so I think a great thing for us to think about as a network is not only how do we integrate across those cross-cutting themes, but how do we rise to the challenges that we're facing. So one theme that I heard was more measures, more often, and earlier. And I think that was consistent across all the groups. You know, when I think back to that 2017 paper, we were only at the stage of it's time to get sensory health incorporated into some of those studies. And I actually do think, thanks to some of the folks in this room, that we have been successful in getting single individual measures into some of these studies. And so I do think that's something that we should really acknowledge. That is progress that we've made, but clearly we need more to answer the questions that we have. And of course, one of those challenges that we face, and as I was just talking with Ali about earlier, is who is going to fund that in this current environment, right? When we're thinking about, especially if we're thinking about a new cohort earlier in life course, funding for that type of work will really be a challenge. So that's something that I think we'll be facing. Another theme that came out to me is just the importance of integration across all the senses. And this is something that we heard in terms of measurement. It was something that we heard in terms of technology and intervention. And, you know, I think that's so critical, but as Natalie so clearly pointed out when we were talking about mechanisms, that's really important, but sometimes it's not the right question. And so I think we just have to be really intentional in thinking about, especially if we look towards developing some sort of multisensory assessment, you know, when is that best to be used and how do we use it? So I think that's one challenge we'd face. Another thing that came out, and this came out, I think, over the course of both days of the conference, is just how important the individual is and the perception of the individual. And that's something that we've not been, I think we haven't done a good job at making sure that we capture. And so I do think, you know, with respect to lived experience, that's something that's really important to think about. And then another thought that came up that I think was cross-cutting across the different working groups was just the importance of disaggregating data, that there are subgroups where we might see different associations. And of course, that's so critical for us to understand and do disparities work and equity work. And of course, the challenge we face with that now is our current environment for funding health equity and health disparities. I think we can rise to all these challenges, but I think it will be tricky. And so I'm looking forward to working with you guys as a network on these problems.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much again. I'm so excited I feel like all these thoughts are swimming in my head. I'm so excited to go back and like look through all the slides and sort of synthesize the information across the senses and across the groups that are really overlapping in many ways. But just some hodgepodge thoughts here that I wanted to add on is I think we didn't really talk too much about qualitative data. And this is something that came up with like the Delphi exercise as well. And because we had to put guardrails somewhere, but I think that adding, prioritizing qualitative data along with quantitative data, so like a mixed methods approach, is really important to capture the lived experience that Jennifer was alluding to, what our patient panel touched on yesterday. So even if it's not always possible to do a mixed method study, I think maybe allowing your research to be informed by qualitative research in that area is really important. And another component of that is also we, in terms of once we sort of go through the research cycle, getting to like the dissemination of research, I think it'd be great for us to think together as a group and individually when we're doing our work about the accessibility of the information that we put out there. I think we often are siloed in our academic circles, read each other's work, but is it actually reaching the people and the groups that it would benefit? So whether that means public-facing dashboards, making sure that in addition to maybe open access, I know open access is an issue because of like, it's so much more expensive, but putting it out there in the gray literature, and I know Nick mentioned like op-eds and just making sure that the information that we're generating is actually being seen by people outside of chambers. And then I think Josh will maybe touch on this a little more, but one thought was, I think this came up in Alden's measurement. Measurement. I remember the figure, Alden, it came back to me. So one was sort of the distinction between self-reported measures and objective measures, and understanding that they're separate constructs, but both valuable, and how it's often difficult. We've seen that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the measurement tools across the different senses, and how easy it might be to administer at like a population based study level. But working towards developing sort of like the US Census in like disability work, we often use the ACS-6 questionnaire, which asks participants if they have difficulty across 6 different areas. So like hearing, vision is a part of it, but also mobility and a few others. But like working towards developing, validating, and then user testing, doing usability testing on a questionnaire that could cover all the different senses. Yeah, that's about it. And yeah, and Jennifer already mentioned this, but really intersectional data and disaggregating information to make sure, since the clinical outcomes, the inclusion and the relevance tends to be different across different groups. So just trying to disaggregate our data when possible, I think would be beneficial. Thank you.
Thanks for those thoughts. They're great. And it's really nice to just think about these things. Hopefully we'll all go home, you know, kind of brainstorming ideas in our head. I wanted to focus a little bit on next steps. So, you know, it was really a heroic effort of Josh and Jennifer to get this network funded. And we have a few years to run with it, and we want to make the most of it. I think this is sort of a kickoff. You know, we've had a lot of online seminars and other activities where we haven't been in person, but this is our first in-person meeting. So it's been really great to meet everybody and just share everybody's ideas. And we're all enthusiastic about sensory research. So it's just really, I have a lot of energy just being here together, which has been great. I think we want to try to channel that energy into work product. One work product will be the paper that will come out of this that everybody will be part of. But then also I had this idea from Pam's wonderful slide of, you know, a little bubble off the sentence network for being coalescence. Love the clever use of words there. So to work on policy, and I was thinking, could we have other work groups to work on the things that are, you know, come out of this? So people who are interested in technology, people who are interested in measurement, people who are interested in intervention, to develop ideas to work together you know, to really take this sort of white paper that we're going to have and make it into reality. We hope that one thing that could come out of that is if each group could think about grants to work on together, you know, and harmonize and you know, get additional funding, because we would love this to be sort of a catalyst for future work in the field and bringing people together, especially across the senses, within these ideas that overlap across all of our interests. So we're going to think about how the network can pull people together and build additional bubbles and connect people. Toward that aim, we'll hopefully circulate all the names and contact information so that if you met someone at this meeting, you can, you know, stay in touch and kind of work together. On that note, we're planning to have a World Congress of Aging, it's called World Congress of Aging, you know, when we move into the next phase of the grant, I think in 3 years, 2 years, about 3 years. So, you know, you're all welcome to come to that. We will invite you to that. And then, you know, your sort of homework over the next few years is to think about who else we should invite. So if everybody could think about, you know, people who didn't come, who wanted to come, or who might be interested in come or could contribute in some way, or, you know, think about that and, you know, bring them in, because we want this network to grow into something that, you know, is meaningful and personable. And, you know, we have a pretty, I mean, I love working on this field because it's kind of a small community. You can know lots of people, and so we can bring in all the people. You know, we still have a small number, but we'll have a bigger army. The two other things I'd like to mention are, you know, we had, you know, a patient advocacy or a patient session, and there are patient advocacy groups in all of the senses, and I think we could do more to involve them in the things we're doing. Whether that's to inform kind of ideas about qualitative studies, to inform policy, to act as advocates. You know, as people had mentioned, you know, nothing changes policy more than a patient story. So I think that's another goal of the network, is to pull that together. And we'd love all your help in bringing ideas for groups. I think I saw some slides mentioning different groups, and we could get even if we could get a list of those and put them on the website so that, you know, people could tap into that. I think that would be great. And then on that note, in terms of bringing out other groups, I mean, people at this meeting have mentioned other parallel scientific groups, workshops, consortia that are doing work that informs what we're doing or is related to what we're doing or who we want to partner with. So I think that would be another kind of focus for the future. Who can we bring in? What other things are going on in related fields, and can we assemble kind of a satellite, a galaxy of other organizations and scientific groups around what we're doing to get our things into their work and their things into our work. So I think that could be something for the future. And finally, sort of funding. So not only federal funding, which may be challenging in the future, but what other ideas can we have from corporate sponsors, both within the sensory fields that we work on and external to that, because I think this is something that taps into the lives of many people in our population across the world. So, you know, should be of wide interest to philanthropy and corporate sponsorships. And, you know, the more funding we can get for the work, the more funding we can get for the network, I think the more things we can accomplish together.
Thanks, Jay. Before I say what I was sort of prepared to say, I just wanted to piggyback on that very last thing you mentioned about funding, and just mention I was discussing with somebody just a couple of days ago here at the meeting yesterday that PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute here in the US, is newly interested in sensory health. So this may be a place that some of us, all of us, a group of us want to go for funding to be doing patient-centered research. They've not invested in sensory health in the past, but are now committed to doing so and have a grant mechanism to do so. So something to keep an eye out on. So I had one thought that I thought I would share kind of relevant to each of the work groups, just kind of a singular thought, and then a couple kind of things for the future. And then we'll just sort of open it up and hopefully have some good additional discussion. When it comes to measures, I think one area where we can really maybe do something constructive and think creatively is around creating standardized protocols. And I was thinking about this earlier and mentioned to a couple people, you know, the cognitive health space has been really good when we think at the population level. at creating this protocol called the Harmonized Cognitive Assessment Protocol. Alden is very involved in this protocol, and it's been widely adapted and adopted to contexts all over the world. And having harmonized protocols, having a standardized protocol that can be adopted and adapted, it can do a lot of good for harmonizing data, for creating not quite plug and play, but protocols that can be used rather easily from study to study. And this may be someplace that we want to go in creating something new, a new product that can be used for collecting data in various contexts, not just in North America, but around the world. And that's not restricted to objective or quantitative measures, but to self-report as well. When it comes to mechanisms, the thought I wanted to share was really just around effect modification and thinking about heterogeneity of effects, and really trying to think hard and doing additional research to understand what are those effect modifiers when it comes to studying whether it's the relationship between sensory health and cognitive health or other outcomes that we really need to be thinking about, because we know that these effects are average effects. They don't necessarily represent anyone. They may just be an average. And we really want to understand how these effects are different in different populations and different individuals. I guess along those lines, also age of onset when it comes to mechanisms is really important and something we know so little about. And I get that question all the time and feel like I have a really inadequate answer when it comes to what it means for somebody who loses vision loss at one age versus another age, or hearing or olfaction, what have you. When it comes to tech and policy and intervention, I was recently speaking with folks at University of Michigan who are implementation scientists and are really interested in what we're doing, and hearing more and thinking about how they could be involved. They don't have anything to do with sensory health and aging, but they were really sort of keen to learn more. And I think learning from our implementation science colleagues and involving them in this work may be a really useful approach to doing some of this translation that we've been talking about away from just kind of academic silos and into the policy world and into the clinic as well. Finally, just a couple future directions. Jay covered quite a number of them nicely. I wanted to just also reiterate something that came up yesterday, that everybody should stay tuned when it comes to pilot grants. We have money to give out for pilot grants. And now that we have, or will have very soon, a list of priority areas that our field hopefully will be focusing on, that may help some of you to kind of crystallize ideas around pilot grants and what you might want to put forward. And certainly the pilot grants will be open to a much wider group than just us. But something to keep an eye on, and something to, especially for junior faculty and junior colleagues, something to be thinking about. The other point I just wanted to make was Jay mentioned I'll get the name wrong, but the Global Congress on Sensory Aging, or something to that effect, World Congress. I bring this up again just to say that, we're a relatively, geographically homogeneous group from North America, but we hope for that future meeting and for the network to really take on a global flavor, because context is so important when it comes to so much of this work. And populations are obviously quite diverse, and we can't necessarily generalize from one setting to another. And it also just simply makes the work a lot more exciting too, to have colleagues from around the world invested and involved. And so we hope that as you tell your networks about Sense Network and about what we've done here over the past couple of days, that we'll be able to grow this in a more global fashion and involve people from other settings.
I think there's been some question. Thank you. I just wanted to follow up because I think there's been some questions about what is the next step with the paper that's coming out of this. And so, definitely with our work group leads, we'll be reaching out to you after we get some structure and organization and ideas, and can use your help in, crafting the language, making sure we're representing the conversation well. But one conversation that we've had, and we just want to make sure everyone is aware, is how much we appreciate everyone's attendance and participation and how critical you all are. So we do plan for everyone who has attended this conference to present that paper on behalf of all attendees. So all attendees will be indexed with reference to the paper that comes out of this conference. So we just are so grateful for your participation and your thoughts. And so we want to make sure that you get the credit as well. So thank you for all the work that you've done over these past couple of days.
I have a few comments from the online participants. So Katie Botang says, Tana would love to be considered as your patient advocacy partner for any PCORI apps pertaining to taste and or smell. And then Kathy, sorry, go ahead. Kathy, you've shared a few links. Do you want to just talk about them?
Yeah, I think it's good to clarify, how US centric versus global you want this to be. And there are a lot of global NGOs very involved in policy at the UN and the WHO and the World Bank and so forth. The one that is very, very engaged with the World Hearing Forum is the International Federation on Aging, which is the hub for age-friendly communities. And they have a special interest that they have flagged on hearing and vision. So I think they are good partners if you want to go global. And I also note that the University of South Florida and Simon Fraser University are holding in Vancouver in the spring the World Gerontechnology Conference. And the leaders of that have expressed to me that they really want to have content on sensory. So that's a kind of immediately coming up way to network beyond our usual circles.
Thank you, Kathy. I think you saw us all write those down. She mentioned them, so thank you. Yep, and so, yeah, absolutely. Open it up now for comments in the room.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for convening the meeting. It, my motivation for coming was to learn, and that you absolutely ticked my box by providing this opportunity. So just to flag another group to network with is the professional interest area in sensory health and cognition in ISTART, the Alzheimer's Society, International Society for the Treatment and Assessment of Alzheimer's Disease. I can never remember the full acronym, but there are opportunities, there's tremendous overlap between our groups, but there's also some distinct representation. There is some opportunity for funds to support groups and meetings coming together. So maybe there's some ideas that we can explore there, and we should think about things maybe that we can do for AAIC coming up. But we'll keep looking for those opportunities.
Another group to consider is the to partner with, particularly when you're looking for patient cohorts to look for sensory testing, is the Alzheimer's Disease Research Centers that are NIH funded. And more the focus is on recruiting patients at an earlier stage of the disease before the biomarker positive but asymptomatic. And I think that would be a great cohort and that's 30 centers. I think that as the tests become like any other, they worry about the burden on the participants. So as the tests become more and more remote, so the less burden, then that be open to that. And they have pilot grants as well to be able to that support junior investigators. And so, that could be a way to get started, get some good data, and then grow from there.
Yeah, I didn't mention it earlier when I was mentioning some of the other centers and what have you that we partner with, but yeah, ADRC is very much on our radar, and Hank Paulson actually runs the ADRC. University of Michigan is one of our advisors. Yeah, I think it's a great thought. Thank you.
We have a comment online. Reno Minhas, World Federation of the Deafblind International Disability Alliance are a few organizations to consider for the World Conference. And Katie Botang, Texas just approved $3 billion to fund a dementia research institute. So I wanted to share that since neurodegenerative disorders relate to all sensory areas. Thank you.
Just thought of one other thing. So, we asked a lot of you to be here and work on this and do and I gave you all kinds of assignments about writing grants and forming work groups. But the other thing is, like, you should also recall that the Sense Network can also help you. So, for example, I've submitted a grant recently, and I asked Jennifer and Josh for a letter from the Sense Network. And sometimes that can show that you're part of a community, or that you have a ways to attract trainees, or you have other ways of publicizing your work. So I encourage, well, I guess you're going to get a lot of letters now, but you have to write the letter. So, it won't be too much burden for Josh and Jennifer. But I encourage you, if you can think of ways that the network can help you in your own work, please reach out to any of us, and we'd be happy to help facilitate in any way we can.
Maybe to that end, I will just also add, we've talked a lot about the data, and Nini is presenting this afternoon her poster on the work that we've done as a network to really create a data bank of existing studies with sensory measures. And that will be, I think, a really important resource for the community. But kind of as the next step, and something else that we've also been working on, it's the primary data collection too. So I just wanted to make sure that's mentioned. So that is another primary charge for our data and harmonization core, is to think about how we can help researchers who want to incorporate primary data collection into their studies. And so that is something that we are working on getting, I think it's like a decision tree, I don't know, up and available on the website. And that's something that we're also available to help support with.
I was just thinking, particularly for the junior people, would it make sense to have, I don't know, like an Excel spreadsheet or something with the attendees of the conference and their main areas of research in terms of their senses that they are interested in, and share that, and again, their email address, if like for those who are interested in doing that, obviously we're not forcing anyone, and share that. I think that would be a great tool, particularly for any trainees, to, if we all say, well, yeah, feel free to reach out to get connected with other PIs in the field or other trainees in the field. And maybe we say what, I don't know what our position is or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. So my understanding is in your packets, everyone has sheets already with the attendees, and it's broken down by the work group assignment. You don't? Okay, that was just for us organizers, but we can share that with you. Okay. So we will be happy to share that. It's already put together. So thank you, Natasha. And thank you, Suze, for doing that. Amazing.
The one thing this is making me think about, like, is there is kind of a matchmaking service for people who are looking for measures and people who are developing measures. Or I don't know whether you have any, I don't know whether you'd want to use Slack or some other way that people communicate and, ask questions to the community. But I think that could be really quite interesting as the network grows.
Well, while we're thinking about networking and building off what Natasha brought up, I think honestly, maybe there's room for a mentorship network in this InSense network, where we're pairing people purposefully who don't share their research too much overlapping, and try to build some more sort of silo breaking within the field via that mechanism.
Yeah, I love that, Nick. Thank you. And it is intentionally part of the pilot funding. So the idea with the pilot funding, once it's announced, is that we were always going to partner some junior and senior folks across the network. But to your point, I think we could do more to integrate that more broadly. So thank you.
So this is really unsolicited feedback. So again, I said being here ticked all my boxes. And what I really appreciated was the perspective from people with lived experience, from my epidemiology colleagues, from my multisensory colleagues, from my new colleagues in industry. That was very valuable. I think where we've got a little bit of lesser representation is in people who are interested in the senses from more foundational or neuroscience viewpoints and methods, both, you know, down to the cell and up through, you know, neuroimaging. So if we're thinking about gaps, that might be an area to do a little more outreach.
Next grant. I love it, Natalie. Thank you. Next cycle. Thank you. Thank you.
And to Jay's comment about kind of diversifying funding sources, there might be some benefit in kind of some discussion or some training and reaching out to other sources of funding outside of NIH funding sources, especially for more junior people who may not have experience developing those relationships with philanthropy or industry.
Are there any final comments or what? Thank you so much, everyone, for this feedback. This really is fantastic. Want to give it just a minute to see if there's any final comments before we move into kind of concluding remarks.
Would the slides from today's presentations be shared with attendees?
Yes, absolutely. We will share with everyone here the slides from the plenary, and everyone who is attending virtual, we will share as well. And so one thing I think it is in our concluding slides is that for our virtual attendees, we will share those slides and then also give feedback for comments or opportunities for comments. And those comments will be incorporated in the final paper as well. So thank you.
Yeah, just a quick note. I think some people also requested the slides from the work groups. So
Well, sorry, that's what I
you're
meant
willing to
was the
share that
work group
too.
slides.
But yeah, while I have the mic, thank you guys for organizing this again and for putting on a wonderful 2-day meeting. And thanks especially to Mindy and Suzanne and everybody else for making it happen.
There's no audio.
Aha, got
Oh,
Keeps turning off.
do you want me to do the handheld? Okay, try it. I can also do the handheld. That's lean over. So thank you again to Mindy. She unfortunately had to leave already, but we're so grateful. I really, really want to thank Katie, who is not even part of the Sense Network, but you are now. We're not letting go of you. Very last minute agreed to come and help out, and you've seen her around and taking photos, and so absolutely amazing. We're so grateful. Thank you for stepping up and helping out today. Justice, we're so grateful for your help too. Our impromptu tech guy, and so this really we couldn't have managed this. So thank you so much for this. And then finally to Suze, you are the mastermind behind this. This really would not have happened without you. And so at this moment, if you wouldn't mind coming up. We just wanted to say thank you so very, very much for everything that you've done. Like, we really are so appreciative. You are amazing. So thank you. Thank you. And then finally, I just want to offer, thank yous to everyone else who has attended as part of this amazing conference. Varshini and Jay were our leaders for this work, and so it really was their vision to put this together. So thank you both so much. I also want to thank all the rest of our steering committee members and Sense Network members, as well as those individuals who stepped up to help, even by passing the mics around today. I know it doesn't sound that loud in the auditorium, but it makes a lot of difference for the folks at home. And so we really are appreciative. So Lindsay, Alden, Nini, Kathy, Nick, Jason, Bonnie, and Cece, I'm sorry your name isn't on here, but thank you for stepping up and helping out as well. Really appreciate it. Really want to thank everyone who's been part of the Delphi working group. This is a tremendous amount of work. They've donated their time, and we know it's going to be an outstanding paper and a really great contribution to the field. Really want to make sure that we thank all of our panelists. I think that was a highlight for all of us over this past couple of days, and really want to thank those folks at RTI who have helped as well.
And I'll just add to that I want to thank you, Jennifer, my co-PI, who's wonderful to work with, and it's been great to plan this over the past many years, actually, that we tried to get this funded. And also Lindsay Delott. I'm on sabbatical right now, and Lindsay has stepped up and done a lot of the PI stuff while I've been on sabbatical. And so thank you very much, Lindsay. As far as next steps go, we mentioned the virtual attendees will have an opportunity to comment on the workshop results. So look for an email from Suze, please. We value your contributions and your feedback. As you guys all know, because we've mentioned it several times now, the consensus recommendations are going to be written into a manuscript, published hopefully in a very high impact peer-reviewed journal. Stay tuned for where we ultimately go with that, but you'll be a part of the process as that moves forward. And please stay engaged with Sense Network. It's likely that almost all of you, if not all of you, are on the email list. If not, consider yourself on the email list now. We'll make sure of that. And we have quarterly online meetings with great speakers, networking events, and also news that's pushed out periodically about things and happenings within the network. And certainly that will be one place, hopefully among many, that things like the pilot grants are announced, links are provided for things like the data bank. And so we hope that'll be a good resource for you. Please stay engaged with us. Please send ideas and please participate. Any other thoughts? You can reach out. You should have our email addresses. That will certainly be in the follow-up information that we provide with everyone's contact info. We want everyone involved, and we welcome your thoughts and input and participation, because the network really is all of us. And now with that, please join us. They're set up out there with wine and beer and posters. And so look forward to seeing everybody out there. And oh, one more thing. The bus will depart at 6:15 to go back to Embassy Suites. Please return cameras if you have a disposable camera prior to getting on the bus. Return your badge if you like, or you can keep it. and have a wonderful GSA or wherever your onward travels take you. Yes, and we'd also like to thank the ASL interpreters who've been working, I'm sorry. Yes, and the CART transcript, who have been working tirelessly over the past couple of days to make sure that that all of what we're doing is accessible. So thank you very much.